And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. It's great to have everyone here. Tonight's going to be a very special show, digging in deep into the Space Force. Of course, I'm joined now by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And it's just been a great week with Olivia sorting these things out. And, you know, one of the key things about tonight's show is that it brings together so many aspects that we've been developing here in the X series. And the X series largely has been an exercise in expanding our knowledge base about how the X Steganography is used. And it takes us into these deeper realms where we accumulate more information, and then the deeper we go, the more information we have to digest and assimilate and really move into kind of an understanding where we reach a different level of looking at things. Now, a lot of different committees that they set out after different things like the environment or studying financial services and studying the economy, what they do is they come in and they look for key factors that will determine the outcome over the next 5 to 10 years. And what we're doing here with the Dark Journalist X series is we're moving into the same type of mindset, which we're looking out over the horizon and saying, how is it that we're going to be affected over the next, say, 10, 20 years by the rapid advancement of this technology? And the most important aspect of it is the aspect that's hidden, not the stuff that we see. So it's very hard for us to scan out and see what's going to come without going into that deeper history. And so the X Steganography is really a kind of an indicator, a symbol. And one thing I want to explain right off the bat is, you know, this is episode 19 in the series, and the things that we've covered in the series could run from the mystery schools on one side, which takes us into a whole journey of secret knowledge from ancient times, brought over through Hermeticism and alchemy and theosophy and anthroposophy, and some of the real giants who I think set up the 21st century for us, like Helena Blavatsky, like Rudolf Steiner, and the work of Edgar Cayce and Annie Besant. These are people who really paved the way, knowing that in 100 years, this was really going to be the foundational work that we're going to need to take a look at. So on the under end of that spectrum, you have this massive mystery around the political situation, the deep state, and the UFO file, and the massive secrecy that's held in the wall, that's held in place, and a group that I call and refer to on this program as X Protect. And X Protect is in place to defend that X technology that is largely found in the UFO file when you're looking at it from a government, institutional, military, and intelligence level. So the penetration of that file constitutes the highest possible clause of secrecy. And therefore, anyone who gets near it is either destroyed personally or discredited in the media. And finally, if those aren't possible, then they resort to more primitive methods that the CIA is well known for. So we have to understand from our perspective what we're into, which is that end of it, the kind of secrecy, the geopolitical secrecy around a particular type of technology is one aspect that we can track. And most often you hear people tracking that aspect. You know, they're looking into, and they very often they do it quite well. But the problem is, the way I was looking at it is that we don't have that full view. And the full view requires that we take into account the mystery schools, the movements in space, which are completely hidden, the geopolitical aspects over the past 100 years, especially, and the modern situation that we find ourselves in with this incredibly fast-moving wave of technological automation, which is moving into robotics and attempting to move us towards transhumanism, and then the massive political forces that are trying to feast on the public and harvest the public's money in between. So we have to take all of that into account if we're going to get a real survey and picture, a snapshot of where things are here in the beginning of the 21st century. And so for me, what I've found most effective is the study of the deep state through the work of Professor Peter Dale Scott. Now, Professor Peter Dale Scott is the person who's given us deep politics, and the term the deep state comes from his work, although the way that he uses the term the deep state is quite different and much deeper than the kind of flimsy thing that you see in the mainstream media about the deep state. And unfortunately, many in the alternative media also throw it around. And if you'd ask even intelligent people in alternative media to define the deep state, very often they go into this idea of these bureaucrats who hang around after an administration is gone and try to hang on to their power. But that's a totally different thing. It has nothing to do with the deep state at all. In fact, the deep state, the way that it's defined in Professor Scott's work, and this is going to help us because we're going to be talking about continuity of government tonight. We're going to be talking about the secret space force that President Trump announced. We're going to be talking about invisible planes and how that forms a foundation of a technology. And we're going to show some things tonight and make some connections that have never been made so far in the series. And it's really, you know, we're getting pretty deep in here as we get into the X, and collectively, you know, I'd say we're all moving up to another level of understanding. And I do want to thank everyone who's been kind of sending their own impressions of what the X is, or you know, some of the things they've discovered on their travels or in their research. And what's great about that is, you know, that kind of interaction is what sparks this fusion and can lead us further than, you know, just the research I'm going to do on it. And I think it's really what we're looking at is this interaction, and that is sort of creating this momentum that we have now in this at this point. Now, one of the things I want to point out before we get started is I do suggest everyone go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. The newsletter's free, and it keeps you in touch. It keeps us both in touch. One of the things that happens with the newsletter is you get it once a week in your inbox. When you sign up for the newsletter, there's a kind of a generic thing that says confirm your subscription. I think a lot of people sometimes flow past that, but the way that mail program works, you have to click that confirm. And that's going to help us because if we have that interaction, if we have that pipeline amongst ourselves, inbox to inbox, then we're not at the mercy so much of social media, which I can tell you right now is taking some severe moves against independent thought. And one of the funny things was, you know, I told everyone today on Twitter to take a look at my Agent Oswald documentary because, you know, it's really the foundation for understanding the critical phase of when the Space Force and the Secret Space Force was developed, and the switch over from the public state to the covert state. That took place in 1963. But you have to understand the dynamics around it, or else you'll go round and round in circles. And that's kind of the way it's designed. So, but when we did that, you know, Olivia and I went to watch the documentary today. And when we went to it, there's a big kind of disclaimer on top now. And it says, you know, Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy. And, you know, it gives you the official thing. And this is how they're going to kind of invade the stuff. So it even, you know, it even looks like it's me putting it up there, right? But I can assure you that it's not. And, you know, I wouldn't put anything up from Wikipedia, frankly, except the bio from the dwarf and the Wizard of Oz, right? That's Olivia's favorite. You're supposed to be on top of that one. So it's great to have everyone here. It's already a huge crowd, and that's fantastic because really, with what we've got tonight, one of the things I really want to get us oriented around is the idea that the Space Force that President Trump announced already exists, and that it's been in action for a long time. And that the way that it was described by President Trump, who was incredibly savagely you know, attacked by the mainstream media and the deep state and the CIA for talking to President Putin, you know, I mean, this is really kind of a fascinating state of affairs. And we're going to get into that big time tonight because hollow people like Anderson Cooper, and their description of the president and as disgusting in the way that he dealt with Putin, because he's not going to war with Putin the way that the Clinton administration was set up to do, so that all the arms marketeers and all the arms manufacturers and GE, which runs MSNBC, and all those people that pay money to CNN and all that, they could get their big payday. The whole thing is about those people drumming up a war, and they're stuck in an old mentality, actually. And that's how they make money, dramatic amounts of money. And we've seen them absolutely freak out. And, you know, maybe they should start taking a lot of those pharmaceuticals that they're running commercials on, because they seem like absolutely psychotic people in the last week, going after the meeting between Putin and Trump. And essentially, one of the key things I think that Trump said was that, you know, he didn't trust the analysis by the CIA of the fact that Russia is supposed to be doing all these things, like meddling in our elections. So, you know, the pushback by the intelligence community was large scale. But the most important thing in all of that hubbub that they were upset about is the same thing they were upset about with Reagan meeting Gorbachev and with Kennedy meeting Khrushchev. That is the specification that no one but an interpreter be present. This is very important. When no one but an interpreter is present, they can discuss the UFO file, and that's the crucial aspect that they freaked out about. That condition that Trump made wisely in his conversation with Putin, that no staff be allowed, no secretaries of state. He just wanted to be one-on-one. This gives them the chance to openly speak about the UFO file. I'm going to get into this. Let's start at the root here, which is this meeting, which was largely resisted. And the CIA came to intervene heavily in the meetings and the contacts and the pipeline that was set up between Khrushchev and Kennedy. And of course, one of the key things we have with Kennedy is in my interview with Douglas Caddy, who was one of the Watergate, a lawyer for the Watergate burglars. He told me that his friend E. Howard Hunt, who was the super spy for the CIA, before he went off to prison, told him that the CIA had assassinated Kennedy over the UFO file. And this is really fascinating because many things have been offered about it. But when you really come down to it, when you get down to the total core, their main kind of place of power, their main kind of hallowed sanctuary of secrecy is the UFO file. That gets deep into the X technology, and it gets into something that I've called apotheum on this program. Now, apotheum, I will go to greater lengths to explain over time, but I've essentially coined it as a term, and this is a word that goes back all the way to Greek times, actually, and forms the basis for the term apothecary. But it represents, through the ages, this reflection of something that is like a reality distortion. A reality distortion field is how I've referred to it. So basically, the idea is that when apotheum takes place, all bets are off. And when you get into things like reports in modern times about things relating to UFOs, for example, we always get the missing time aspects. We always get the electrical dysfunction aspects. And you get, it's sort of like the world gets turned upside down and then turned right again. There's some interference in fundamental physics when this field, this reality distortion field, comes in. And when that takes place, the volatility of it is something that has been observed now by militaries and intelligence teams. And what they have decided is that anything close to it, that when they make attempts to control it, it becomes a higher secret than the atomic bomb. So when these people go out on their own and discuss it, the Kennedys of the world, and when they try to connect up with their Russian counterparts, who are also very, very steeped in the UFO file, and I'm going to get into just how tonight, and I'm going to introduce some people that you may not have heard of who were managing the UFO file on the Russian side. When they get into that point, what happens is they're determining the real future. They're addressing what's behind that secret curtain, even if they can't get their hands totally on it, as presidents very often can't. And as we found out sometime during the Eisenhower administration, it slipped away, and the battle to get it back in the Kennedy administration resulted in his assassination. So when they get a chance to lock heads together, the two heads of state of Russia and the US, the deep state goes bonkers. And that's the CIA, the media, Wall Street, the corporate interests, because they're losing control in those moments. So those 2 hours that Putin spends with Trump, if they spend even 15 minutes of that discussing the UFO file, I'm sure they spent more, it's a real problem for the deep state. That's why you see the freak out. The meeting between Gorbachev and Reagan at Reykjavik, which was crucial to nuclear disarmament, and that's something that Reagan achieved, even though they called him a hawk and a crazy movie actor who's going to blow up the world and all the rest. And, you know, it's kind of fascinating now because liberals used to play the role of saying we were too hawkish and all the rest of it. And now they seem to be playing the role of, you know, you're not tough enough on that damn Russian President Putin, you know. And it's fascinating because former Reagan financial advisor David Stockman makes the great point that Russia, in its current state, you know, they spend in a year what we spend in 2 weeks on military defense. So let's think about that and keep things in context. He also said that their economy is basically the size of Manhattan, you know. So in terms of the world threat that they're supposed to be posing to us, yes, they have nuclear weapons and they're a nuclear power, but as far as I can tell, there's no reason to commit suicide and launch nukes at America. So, you know, working with them and working at better relations and take them on as a partner to help us in other areas of the world makes really good sense. The idea of going to war with them is so outdated, but we have to explore it again, related to the UFO file, or related to the X technology. Why, oh why, is Russia such an outcast? Well, in this conversation, according to Gorbachev, who came out last year during this press event where Charlie Rose, before the sex scandal, you know, was there interviewing him, and there were people like Kissinger in the audience. And Kissinger, as we know, is very privy to all of Nixon's knowledge around the UFO file and the time capsule that he left. He's in the audience, and he really, you know, his jaw drops when out of the blue, Gorbachev starts talking about when Reagan approaches him and says, you know, totally seriously, on their own, no one else with them, will you help us if we're attacked by an off-world civilization? And Gorbachev said he was stunned by the question, but Reagan was totally serious. So he said, yeah, I will help you. And Reagan said, good, because we'll help you too. So he was absolutely determined. Now, what we understood was that Reagan was getting intel, and it was showing these large craft around the rings of Saturn, like refueling or something. And they got into this whole Star Wars pose with the Strategic Defense Initiative to basically prepare to do battle with this thing that's out there. Now, as we were looking at Kennedy and all the rest of it, we know that he tried to share the UFO file with the Soviets, and it's one of the reasons that he got assassinated. And of course, 10 days before he's assassinated, he's like, basically, you know, we need to lower the threat around the nuclear idea. They might mistake a UFO for a US bomber over one of their sites, so we have to share that high-level intel with them. That's where people stop responding to him, and 10 days later, he's assassinated. Now, there may have been reasons, and there may have been plans in place, but certainly, you know, the relationship between those two and his space initiatives and the fact that he really wanted a joint moon mission is largely what we're discussing here tonight, the whole idea of a space force. You think Trump wants to do a space force alone? No, he's doing that same thing again. He's bringing in the intel from the Russian side and saying, let's do this together. There's something else in the UFO file we need to address together. And when you get around this issue, it puts too much power in the hands of the public representatives, that is the President of the United States and the President of Russia, and not this invisible deep state, which is used to pulling all those strings. So we're starting to get a picture of what's happening. But Reagan meets with no interpreter, with no staff, just an interpreter. Kennedy meets with no staff, just an interpreter. And here we have President Trump meeting Putin. No staff, just an interpreter. What happens immediately afterwards? The deep state goes crazy. I mean, basically calling for, you know, human sacrifice of the president. It's just absolutely insane. And but clearly, the alarm bells he's setting off, announcing the Space Force, teaming up with Russia, and moving away from the FBI, CIA corruption. It's in a very dangerous impasse, I'd say, between the two. Now, the way that they dealt with it, that is on the deep state side versus Kennedy, we know how that ended. When they had the interaction level, there were several levels working against Nixon, and we know how that ended. They got him out of there, and you know they were threatening him with life in prison. With Reagan, they saw an early opening to do an assassination attempt. So what we have essentially is when we get to Kennedy, I've gone into the Blue Gemini aspects also, which is that secret space initiative that was going on with Blue Gemini. He takes back basically and says, we're not going to make it for war. I don't know what you're up to, but you people at NASA, who are supposed to be a civilian agency, under the influence of von Braun, this is getting out of hand. So he took Robert McNamara, his defense secretary, sent him in there and said, cut it out. And he threw Blue Gemini, this very unusual program, back to the military, which is a very unusual move in the Kennedy administration. So when we see this handshake, we're looking at, you know, Kennedy's assassination that took place, and we're looking at the assassination attempt against Reagan to put Bush in place, who was a much more favorable face for the deep state. And they did get him 8 years later, but they weren't able to get Reagan out. In this case, the push to get Trump out poses a real danger to America. And I can't say that enough, that CNN and MSNBC, the whole push on it, and the way that they're trying to whip up the sentiment and the way that the deep state is using these groups as tools really shows that the deep state is all about civil war. They're all about chaos and turmoil, and they're all about retaining power when these things are going on. So when we see calls like that to say, like, let the CIA remove the president and the CIA coup, you know, that whole theme, it has to be rejected, regardless of if somebody respects Trump or not, you know, or if they support him or not, because the CIA should never, ever be allowed to remove a duly elected president. And I'm going to go into some of Harry Truman's comments about that tonight, because he's the one who invented them, essentially. But before I go any further, I'm checking in with Miss Olivia.
I have kind of an intriguing question if you want to field one right now.
Absolutely, sure.
Okay, so Tricky Vicky asks, are Reagan's Star Wars rays still operative?
Star Wars rays?
Rays.
R-A-Y-S.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. The technology got converted partially into HARP. So in terms of it being activated, one of the things, and you'll find a lot of this in Ilana Freeland's work and her work around the space fence, which comes into this whole picture, of course. But one of the things that she said was that at the time, one of the things that SDI wanted to do, it didn't have the power in the atmosphere to do. And that's something that came through the HARP patent, which relied very much on the work of Nikola Tesla, who wanted to electrify the atmosphere. And the ionosphere, electrifying that became the job of HARP. So a lot of the SDI HARP continuum, that's sort of where that continuum goes after the Soviet Union falls. The SDI Star Wars aspect was built not only as a threat to kind of block nuclear missiles from the Soviets, but it had a real foundation in protecting us, building up a protection against whatever it is that's active in the UFO file. So it is quite fascinating the way that it comes out, but SDI definitely, absolutely continued. And that is a great question, and that's a great name there, Tricky Vicky. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is interesting too, I mean, to consider, because when we look at the technological side, we can get hints from it. You know, the work of Nick Begich, for example, on HARP, really helps us get, I think, to where we need to go. And there's a big technological question tonight, because The invisible technology becomes the very heart of the UFO file, and I'm going to show how, and I'm going to show that's where the big impasse is right now between the deep state and the Trump administration. One of the dumber things that we saw was this whole move by the TTSA, which is a CIA hangout, and that group moving actual CIA agents to the fore to take over the UFO field. And people like Luis Elizondo, whose boss, John Brennan, who was known as the Drone King because he was the guy who would go into Afghanistan and target a wedding and kill 60 guys, 60 people at a wedding and families to get one guy. This was his business. And he was the CIA director under Obama. But his big point is always, Trump is a demagogue and there'll be consequences for meeting with Putin and all that, because he's in league with this deep state aspect trying to control the UFO file. But guys like that were in charge of, and Luis Elizondo's boss. I mean, Elizondo, when you hear these things and he comes on Coast to Coast and he chit chats with George Knapp, who apparently has forgotten how to be a journalist, it's a disgrace. I mean, this is a CIA open, bald-faced attempt with billionaire money and intel connections and Harry Reid in the middle of it to subvert public inquiry into the UFO file. And it should be rejected immediately. And in a week, Elizondo is taking over MUFON, and he's going to give the keynote speech and all the rest of it. And, my feeling on that is deliberate. That is the CIA in the heart of the UFO field. So if you want CIA UFO disclosure, you got it. But if you want something better, if you want to get to the bottom of it, if you want to throw the CIA out and abolish the CIA and get them away from these things and get that deep state force out, so that we get a chance to look at this reality, then you start with the, ringers that they send out to control the narrative. And Elizondo is certainly one of them. So, and he is part of that larger structure of TTSA, which is a kind of a for-profit, freak design company by Tom DeLonge, which is a CIA prop for Lockheed Martin. And we know from the work of Catherine Austin Fitts that Lockheed Martin basically was the main driver for the black budget because they control all of the data and they won't allow the government basically to have a real audit because they won't give those files away to people who want them. So you get into the missing trillions aspects. So we need to look at this. We need to understand that when we're describing these things that we're actually right in the middle of them. So when we see the deep state go after the Trump administration, we understand that it's largely over the UFO file, and I'll explain how. I promise you that tonight. So the first thing I'm going to do, though, is really articulate this aspect around the invisible technology and how this apotheum effect in the UFO file is the most guarded secret in the national security state. And it comes directly out of the UFO file. And we've shown that it goes way further back beyond the UFO file. We're talking periods in history that go back to ancient Egyptian times that relate to a legacy culture. That's basically referred to as Atlantis. That's the way we understand it. But you're getting very deep when you get into the X Steganography. Now, for people who aren't aware of it, one of the things I want to point out is that the X itself has shown up in a series of X letters. And I show the letters very often in the show. And for the people who are regulars, they know at some point I'm going to pull out that X letter at the LBJ library, or the X time capsule, that Project X that Eisenhower has that's due to be open in 2053. But what I describe these as, and why they're so fundamental to the research I'm doing, is they should be described aptly as stealth archives. And the reason they're stealth archives is that we know they exist. We know that they're there, but they're not there because we can't see them. So stealth archives are absolutely crucial to that program of steganography, because I can still relate a message by saying to you this thing exists. And so I'm still engaging in a process, but the public can't have access to it. And there are ways and means to do this. And when I've looked into it, I've showcased maybe 4 or 5 examples of stealth archives. There are hundreds. So these things are spread out. And so the X Steganography becomes the kind of clue in the Rosetta Stone to help us read the Egyptian hieroglyphics. It gives us the bigger picture And so we're going to get into what it is that they're doing with that. But what I think is crucial to consider is the invisible technology is something, we talked about Apotheum, we've talked about the UFO file and the secrecy behind it. Now we're going to look at one of the aspects of what they're hiding, and it's a biggie. So let's start with this. This is President Trump. It was a flap that came up about 6 months ago with him describing, quote, invisible planes. Now, he did that at a meeting with people from Lockheed, and he did it again in a non-press event. So this is something that he got in his head, he heard about, he found out something about it, and he just couldn't help himself. Now, we do know that Trump likes to brag a lot, and the national security state likes to keep their secrets. But a lot of the articles that came out afterwards were like, how dare he say that? That could give our allies the wrong idea and set off World War III. But what they're really trying to do is tamp down the fact that he gave out a secret there. And, Trump has a little bit of the Winston Churchill tell the people aspects to him because he wants to brag and take credit for what we got. Now, very unusually, when you get into real things related to the UFO file, you're going to find in those stories over and over again this amazing question of invisible UFOs. So there's a classic story, actually. This one is from 1943. Let's get into that first. It's by Cheryl Costa as the story, and the title of the story is 1943, The Navy Float Plane and the Invisible UFO. This is from 43. Not a case that's brought up very much, but I'm going to read just a little bit here so you get kind of an idea. So the World War II encounter story involves a United States maritime cargo vessel, a Navy cruiser, and a Navy float plane that hit an invisible UFO. Jeez, it sounds a little like the Tic Tac UFO, right? Well, it's going to play right into it. In 2004, a man named Frank in his mid-80s described himself as a World War II veteran. He tells us that during the war, he was a U.S. Army infantry officer. Frank explained that he was on board the MS Sea Witch, a pre-war U.S. maritime cargo vessel that was anchored in the Fiji Islands. An accompanying vessel, a heavy cruiser, USS Chicago, was among the ships there. The Chicago was equipped with 4 Curtiss SOL Seagull Scout observation float planes. All right, so it's like it's definitely a small landing carrier. About an hour later, Frank and about 25 witnesses on the Sea Witch were watching the observation float plane as it returned from its morning surveillance mission. The float plane had descended about 600 feet, preparing to make its water landing. He said all the observers were stunned as the aircraft appeared to fly into an invisible object. 1943. The plane simply stopped flying for an instant and fell vertically into the ocean as a ball of tangled metal, Frank said. Frank explained it was obvious to everyone who witnessed the event that the pilot and observer were killed in the collision. The USS Chicago mounted no recovery effort. They knew it was all over. To this day, he remembers this odd event like it was yesterday and wondered what it was that the float plane hit. After the war, the MS Sea Witch was sold many times to numerous foreign owners. I found that very strange also. That gives us, I think, the thrust of that story. The idea is there's a technology out there that these crafts display where they can not only disappear off radar, but they can actually blink out of eyesight. But they're still there as a mass. So they have, we've seen it so many times in science fiction literature and programs. We have the cloaking device. It is, you can't see me anymore, and I'm not on your radar, so there's no way to shoot at me. Now, there's no question with the series of reports about these types of invisible encounters that, this is a technology that they possess on that UFO side. Now let's go a little bit deeper. Leaked Pentagon report reveals supersonic UFO could make itself invisible, interacting with mysterious underwater object. This is in Tech Times, and it's referring to the Tic Tac video. And I told you that the TTSA thing was going to come up. Now, what's interesting and how I'm going to describe what the TTSA is using with this story about the invisible UFO has to do with the invisible plane technology, which is something that we acquired from the UFO file. So we're going to get deeper into it here, but let's keep rolling. Military report, UFOs may have attempted rendezvous with giant undersea object. Water beneath UFO looked like something rapidly submerging from the surface. Okay, so this is the same report relating to the Tic Tac again, and it says, although we never made visual contact, whatever caused the disturbance, the report stated that it may have been caused by an AAV, which was unseen due to cloaking or invisible to the human eye. So here again, we have this description of this invisible technology, and in relation to UFOs, it's just inescapable. I could read reports on this all night. One of the things I'll describe is that during the Phoenix Lights, many people saw that incredibly large craft hovering over the city, but there were some neighborhoods that were looking up, and they would see this craft go through, and they could see through it. So it was in a semi state of invisibility. I think this is a very important thing for us to get our minds wrapped around, that the UFO cases contain a huge amount of these invisible UFOs. So the secret Space Force now is going to come into play when we start to look at the invisible technology. But let me give you a few more examples of the invisible UFO technology before we look at the Space Force. And I want to remind you that you're watching Dark Journalist. And I want to also suggest that you go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our free newsletter. That keeps us in touch, keeps us outside of the censorship of social media. And hopefully, every time you return on Friday, you're going to find me here on this live stream. But just in the off chance that those social media companies take a walk, then we're going to have that pipeline assured between us right now. And that's kind of the best and the most secure way for us to move forward. Okay, The Guardian. Again, different meeting this time. Donald Trump. Trump hails invisible plane and remarks to Coast Guard, the enemy cannot see it, quote unquote. Discussing the Air Force when speaking of a different service, the president again praises the F-35, which he says is not visible and has faced a costly development process. Telling U.S. Coast Guard audience the Air Force was ordering a new plane that was almost like an invisible fighter. Said Trump, the F-35, you can't see it. You literally can't see it. It's hard to fight a plane you can't see. So that's right out there in the public that it's invisible. Now, the question is, the Space Force gets announced 2.5 months later. What is it about the invisible technology? Where does it come from? Where does the F-35 come from? How does it relate to the X technology? I thought you'd never ask. Let's take a look. The F-35 comes directly from the X-35, which also is the prototype for the X-37B, which orbited the Earth for 270 days and whose contents are classified. And with good reason, no question. Now, the X-35, which, remember, is the root of the F-35 that Trump is talking about as a plane, a fighter plane, the F-35, comes from this space plane, the X-35. Let's take a look at it before we go deep. This is the patch for the X-35. And, of course, it's Lockheed Martin, brought to you by the United States of Lockheed Martin. Very interesting thing it says up here, hat trick. And then it's got the Royal Air Force, Royal Navy involvement, the Air Force, Marines, and the Navy. And a hat with 3 aces in it. The ace of hearts, the ace of clubs, and the ace of diamonds. So I'll get back to this shortly, and the actual image. I'm going to show you a couple of versions of this image. Here it is actually on a plane. Hat trick. Let's keep that in mind. Here is the hat trick on the actual X35. The hat's here, logo with the 3 aces and 7 X's above it, giving us a real indication of where the technology comes from. Now, I want to take us back in mind to the Alice in Wonderland episode that we did a couple of weeks ago. And well, we found this kind of reality distortion effect, this apotheum taking place in Alice in Wonderland. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we found about 50 years later is the military analyzed it and discovered that Alice was in hyperspace. And she had entered the 4th dimension. So they were getting close to understanding the root of what the story of Alice in Wonderland was all about. This hat trick is a real reference to invisibility. There's a sports reference which has to do with, when somebody does a hat trick, it's like pulling off 3 stolen bases in a row, or he's had 3 knockouts in a row, or 3 touchdowns or field goals in a row. It is generally used in a sports arena. But the actual hat trick term comes from a magician's hat trick. And what he's doing is he is producing, manifesting something. He is getting into this process where he is able to create something out of thin air. So this is a very early turn of the century magician doing a little rabbit out of the hat trick vibe, just to get us in that hole. And somehow, it's true, rabbits come up a lot in the show. They're used much more than I realized by mystery schools at symbology. So it gets fascinating even for me, which is good. And of course, we know that Olivia's a big fan of rabbits also. Mm-hmm. So in going deep on this, the X35 is where the Dornberger program went. Now let's double back momentarily to where the X-planes come from. Now the X-planes, I have a whole kind of layout here. I'm going to do this quickly. The X-planes come from the work of Walter Dornberger, and Dornberger was the head of the Nazi program that, created the rocket program for the Nazis, and he was Werner von Braun's boss. And of course, von Braun was our main scientist that got us to the moon, etc. Now, I wanted a shot of Dornberger in here. Two of the key things and how I'm going to show that Dornberger is related now to the things that are going on with the Trump administration is that Peter Strzok, who is, one of the key FBI people who was so against Trump that in trying to defend Hillary Clinton and working, with his mistress there, Lisa Page, who's an FBI lawyer, he sent these messages back and forth saying, don't worry, we're going to stop Trump, suggesting the FBI was going to collude to stop Trump, probably using this phony Russian dossier story. But in the middle of all that, people started to get curious about Strzok and who he was, and he gave a bizarre, truly bizarre appearance before the Senate House Committee on the Russian scandal. And really, they took him off of Mueller's team, and they might just show him the exit for the FBI, period. But one of the things I think we found out about Strzok is that he grew up in Iran, and that his dad was deep, deep, deep in the CIA. But the very interesting thing that was a little bit, and I will read this later, is just this little tiny mention in his bio that he was a main figure at Bell Helicopter on his way up. Well, Dornberger was the president of Bell Helicopter. He gave us the X-Plane series. So the X-Plane series featured very prominently in this whole battle between Kennedy and the deep state over the space program and what would become the Space Force. So we understand now, when we're seeing the battles between Peter Strzok and Trump and the things that they've found out, that again, we're looking at this element of the X technology working its way through. Because certainly if Strzok's dad was a part of Bell Helicopter and Dornberger created the X-planes He's a paperclip Nazi who created the X-plane secrecy. We've only found out really about the X-planes since 2014. I mean, yes, they've been out there, but we've never collectively known that program there of all experimental planes being rolled out until the last 4 or 5 years, really. So one of them that really grabbed my imagination was found in the files of Guy Bannister. I've brought Bannister up a few times on this show, so if you've heard his name before, there's a good reason. But Guy Bannister, when he died shortly after the Kennedy assassination, he was one of the main sponsors of Lee Harvey Oswald, and he was a super right-wing fanatic FBI chief who was the FBI chief in charge of the UFO file. So to make a long story short, when he died, his files were burned, but his wife saved the list of files and sold them off later. And one of them, which I point out at this show, is called Dinosaur Space Warcraft. Now, the X-20 is something I've already gone into very deeply, but I want to remind us something about the X-20, which is it's the stand-in for Blue Gemini, which relates to that battle that Kennedy was having, taking the secret Space Force back from this deep state, taking the UFO file reins back. The dinosaur plane, this is listed as just an observation vehicle or a cruising vehicle or space plane. It's not listed as a warcraft. As a matter of fact, they avoided all those terms. Bannister, who knew the UFO file, had been in the FBI, and was closely associated with the JFK assassination, in his own files, he's calling it a warcraft. So the X-20 dinosaur becomes the kind of hardcore indicator for what they're doing. They're creating a space war force. That's what it's all about. People like Kennedy, people like Reagan, actually wanted to keep the war aspect out of it. So this is where they got into problems. That's a quick shot of Bannister there. And of course, his links to Oswald and the Kennedy assassination are well known. But I think what we're getting here is that when we look at the X-planes and we look at the secrecy around them, we're understanding a fundamental thing about how the government is run and how it's set up to develop this technology out of the UFO file, and anything that's even close to the UFO file, that is close to unveiling it, like the Garrison investigation in the 60s, or later investigations that came up that get close to it, people get, annihilated. People get really bumped off. And one of them I want to point out, and just to give you an idea, by the way, that's in... this one, I think, is in Air Nation. Here are the X-planes, the secret of X-planes. They're finally letting out some details about what they are. The X-planes come directly out of Dornberger's work, and that relates directly to the X technology coming out of the UFO file. Okay. One of those people who ran smack into X-Protect was Morris Jessup. Now, he relates to the work we're doing tonight, and I'll tell you why. Jessup was an astronomer, actually, and a professor of astronomy, and an incredible author. He was one of the intellectual heavyweights dealing with the subject, and he wrote the classic book, The Case for the UFO. So with that kind of heft, he was getting a lot of attention for the work he was doing. And at that time, the X-Protect groups worked through CIA, covert arms of the FBI and the CIA, and they formed a group that would step in sometimes and do things that the FBI or the CIA would look at it and be like, what just happened here? Who are these people? So it's quite fascinating. What happened with Jessup is they tried to first destroy his reputation. What he was saying essentially was, these craft are powered by anti-gravity. And he was giving details, and he was going through it like an astronomer or an astrophysicist would. So he posed a kind of a danger, and he was a very public figure. So what they decided to do with him was keep a really close eye on him. Now, one of the weird things that happened, and it's a strange footnote in his story, is that his book, The Case for the UFO, got sent to the Department of the Navy with all these annotations in it. And it was somebody who claimed to be at the Philadelphia experiment. The Philadelphia experiment, in short, was something called Project Invisibility, where they wanted, with Einstein's help, to make a ship invisible and then reappear somewhere else. This is something that would be great strategically for war, but it was very dangerous to try. And long story short, there's so much good work, including by my friend Alexandra Bruce, on the Philadelphia experiment, that I won't go into the details here, but again, relating to invisibility. Now, it just so happened that the day that Jessup was found on the highway with, you know, his carbon monoxide poisoning, and that he had basically killed himself in his car, he was on his way over to see someone named J. Manson Valentine. And he said to him, I have the key to the Philadelphia experiment, which is all about Project Invisibility. Well, once that call went through and he was headed over there, it's pretty clear the X-Protect people just removed him from the picture. But again, it's relating to this invisible technology that comes out of the UFO file. This was the problem. Interestingly enough, as a little side note, J. Manson Valentine would become the person who would discover the Bimini Road that Edgar Cayce predicted in Bimini. And in 1968, just as Cayce suggested, it would be found there. So Manson Valentine certainly has an interesting history, but it was Jessup who was on his way over to see him for that. So this technology that we're discussing, just like the disappearance of the Tesla files and Trump's uncle's involvement, we have to look at these things in a different light, because what it is, we have to connect them up and have them not just be curiosities along the way. If we understand that they're part of a program called X-Protect, which will do anything, and I mean anything, to remove threats to getting this information out, having this information in the UFO file come out publicly, and having to explain it, or someone encroaching just a little bit on their territory, then we have to understand how those forces have operated. You know, we've talked about things like the black budget on this show and the secret system of finance. And, you know, what they used to call the secret space programming, I'm referring to the secret space force, because that's really what it is. There never was a program. So when we look at that setup, we're getting an idea here of what it is that they think is at stake. But we need that knowledge, because we were not going to understand deep events like the Kennedy assassination or 9/11 or these different the financial coup d'etat without understanding how things actually work here on planet Earth. So if the UFO file is a more important secret than the atomic bomb, then let's figure out what's inside the UFO file. The invisibility technology, there's no question that that's in there. Now, just on a lark, I do want to get into where this has come out in pop culture. Someone mentioned it before, which is Wonder Woman, which is a real Olivia favorite.
I love her.
And of course,
I have 2 T-shirts, Wonder Woman T-shirts.
There's strong resemblance going on there. It's uncanny.
I wish.
But that, of course, is Wonder Woman. And oddly enough, in the story, you know, Wonder Woman comes out of this almost Atlantean type place and shows up in World War II. Pretty interesting the way that they plug it in. But sometimes writers have knowledge or talk to people about projects and it gives them ideas, or they're plugged into a certain set of tools. This is what's displayed in the series of the invisible plane of Wonder Woman. So we've seen this kind of creep over into the public entertainment zone. Oddly enough, if you look at the setup of where the invisible plane mythology comes from in the fantasy entertainment realm, in Wonder Woman, the invisible plane is a creation of Diana's during her younger years on Paradise Island, Atlantis. She created it to be an improvement on her mother's planes, which would be shot down in a man's world. So as they go deeper into it, it's actually alien technology that is given to Wonder Woman by this group that lives underground in Antarctica. Now, is that not fascinating, considering the amount of alternative research around the alien field and around Antarctica. So something tells me that these stories around the invisible plane that spill over into this fantasy entertainment realm actually, relate to something like cloaking technology, for example. We know very well that when we look at certain Star Trek episodes, they were largely influenced by theosophical comments. Now, it's kind of interesting for us to look at it this way because we start to get an idea that, there are groups out there who use different ways and means to get ideas out. But certainly just back there in our unconscious is this kind of functioning idea that invisibility is achievable. We know that the invisible man and all these different types of things have come out. But just how much power would you have if you were invisible, as it were? Let's keep going down this rabbit track. It's not quite a rabbit hole, of course, disappearing down the rabbit hole. So when we've looked at the X-35B, which is the predecessor to the F-35, or actually it is in the same line, and it's derived, the F-35 fighter is derived from it. Trump's calling it invisible, and Marilyn Lockheed is stepping in and saying, in these meetings, he's certainly right, it's invisible, ha, ha, ha. She's trying to take the edge off to not let it out, that he is basically spilling the invisibility aspect. But we see this now as the height of the X program on the plane side, the X space planes. We've already described how the X-15 still holds the speed records. And these are planes that were done in the 60s. How does that wash? Doesn't really. So who is the group that creates this environment where things can be developed and the public can't see them? We certainly know there's a number of military bases they would do it. But it's not just the military because, as we know with the military, loose lips sink ships. You need something deeper. You need a whole infrastructure. And we've been moving in the Space Force towards a space infrastructure that needed to be developed, but no one could actually observe its development. Many people have assumed for this reason that they moved the technology and the development underground, which makes pretty good sense. So let's take a quick look at that. While we're doing that, Olivia, how are we doing?
We're doing great. So many questions. I'm completely behind.
Well, it's fantastic. You're the best questioners on the planet. We have so many people with us now. It's fantastic. You're with Dark Journalist and Olivia, and Olivia is out there really mixing it up with everyone, selecting the best questions. I should have said it earlier, but ask your questions all in caps because that helps her really to sort out what's what there and who's who. Did
you mention that Wonder Woman does this to block? She makes symbol of the X.
True, that's a great point, and that's a classic. That's a classic. It's a classic Masonic move, also. Exactly. You might see all those Aleister Crowley pictures with one thumb against this temple and one thumb against that temple, and the hands like that. That is pure Masonic steganography of the deepest kind. And one of the things I think I do want to also stress that when we're talking about this is, we can understand the X without, well, I don't want to engender it as like a fear. I want it to be more of a mystery thing where once we get knowledge of it, we can start to see other things in other areas open up to us. An entire field of science opens up to us. An entire hidden field of advanced technology opens up to us. An entire history of mystery schools moving this kind of technology around, or I should say the effects of this technology, and recording it over thousands of years. We're getting into a very deep story here that relates to our history. And so I know there's a tendency to be like, oh my God, the X has control of everything and they're going to bomb us from outer space. And there's always a certain amount of truth in these jokes. But the idea is what they're doing is they're seeking control from space to the things that happen on Earth and outward. So to get that global control grid going, they need something like the space fence, which I've talked about with Elena Freeland. And what she tells me the core of the space fence although it's ostensibly to pick up space garbage, which is a joke. But it's run from this little tiny island by Lockheed Martin. And what they're doing with it is, according to freelance research, who knows a great deal about HARP, who knows a great deal about chemtrails, who knows a great deal about the science behind these things, and I highly recommend her work on the space fence, is, she said its main function is surveillance down to the DNA level. So we have to keep that in mind as we go along here, because there's been a lot of information about xDNA that I have not put out there, because I've wanted the foundation to be with the mystery schools, with the technology, with the UFO files, so we understand how it operates. Once we get into speculating on the xDNA, there are factors in the xDNA that relate to the X research. There's no question about it. But if we have the foundation and understand it here, there'll be less speculation when we get into the DNA part. So I appreciate when people make comments about it. And trust me, I'm studying it. I have some pretty good dialogues going on around that. Okay. Let's talk about continuity of government and the Doomsday Network. In the work of Professor Peter Dale Scott, which we started with, if you want to understand the deep state and how they operate, there's two books you need. One is Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. The other is The American Deep State. The other book I can recommend, I mean, Cocaine Politics, there are so many books, I would say, from Scott, but the two crucial ones, American Deep State and Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. Scott's been talking about the deep state for years. He's been writing since 1967, I think. And he's a former Canadian diplomat who is a professor at UC Berkeley, and just one of the best assets, I think, that we've had to research that gets us into what's really happening on the political side. And he's been largely plagiarized in the alternative world, but not given credit very often, nor well understood, because he's operating with so many nested details on this completely different level. And most of the research that he did was even before the internet, so just incredible. One of the things I want to mention in tandem here with that, and I don't have her picture handy, but is the work of Mae Brussell, who was an incredible researcher that was a pioneer. She died in 1988. And Mae Brussell, fundamental core research. She went so deep into things like the Kennedy assassination and the CIA drug running and secret societies and so on. She sort of was far in advance of anything as kind of trendy as Alex Jones or something. But and she was studying things like the Bilderberg group there back in the 70s and 80s. Quite incredible woman. But the key thing that she said, that she surmised after years and years of research, is that ultimately this group, which she saw having a real post-war Nazi core element to it, as many researchers like Dr. Joseph Farrell see, she saw this group as wanting to hold power from space. This is the whole object of what they're up to commit genocide from space, to have this kind of totalitarian global control grid. That's where her work and her research led her after 30 years. And she was one of the best. She was one of the best brains that we had. Professor Scott's work doesn't touch on space so much, but when he touches on continuity of government, he leads us all into understanding how this space secrecy works. And especially in my time with him, and we've got many interviews up there with Professor Scott for free that you can watch. And I will take that opportunity here to say, do sign up for the newsletter, because that's a great way for us to keep in touch. And do go to darkjournalist.com to sign up for it. And you will find the interviews I did with Professor Scott and the hours I spent with him. They're all there under Deep Politics on the site. Now, one of the things that we have to understand, I'm going to give a brief version of continuity of government. Continuity of government was set up as soon as nuclear technology became, was proliferated. And we needed the idea of creating a totally secret government underground that would take over in the event that the surface got nuked and that the president and the vice president were taken out. So that's where continuity of government originally came from. Little by little, it got the nickname Doomsday Network. And Doomsday Network actually applied to the communications that they used. Now, this is a very key, important factor. The Doomsday Network can only be activated in the case of an emergency. So when something happens that's related to a nuclear threat or whatever, the communications go through the Doomsday Network. However, people have abused the fact that this thing exists. And COG is the shorthand for it. That's continuity of government. It means in the event of a major nuclear attack, the government will still continue. What happened, it's quite telling, in the 1980s, is that this got changed. And the people who changed it were Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and Oliver North. And at the time, Rumsfeld was the CEO for a chemical company. And they gave us aspartame, which all of us got to drink in our Pepsi until there was a huge uproar from all the cancer-causing aspects to aspartame. But interestingly enough, these people who showed up around continuity of government, Professor Scott, in his research, found whenever he was researching the deep state around things like the JFK assassination or Watergate or Iran-Contra or 9/11, whenever there was a major event that changed policy and that was covered up and there was a commission about it or whatever it happened to be, somehow the COG people and the people associated with continuity of government were always on the scene. So let's take a look at a few of them and who they were. In the case of the Kennedy assassination, it was Winston Lawson, who was the Secret Service agent who set up the route, actually, that they drove past the patsy, Lee Harvey Oswald, who was having a code at the time. In setting up the route, he did something, which is he used the Doomsday Network to communicate with the White House. Now, he didn't use the ordinarily Secret Service channel. That's the ordinary way that they would go about getting into this. He used this very, very unusual method. And I'm trying to see if I have, just bear with me a second. I have this shot of Lawson in here. Lawson is a fascinating character from a Secret Service perspective. And I always hope that people would do more research on him. But Professor Scott points him out because he used the Doomsday Network and he set up the travel route, and the president, of course, was assassinated. So there's the first COG tie-in with a deep event. Let's go a little bit further. James McCord, who was one of the Watergate burglars, he was associated with continuity of government. John Dean, who is the person who really took down the Nixon presidency, well, he actually was working for the Pentagon, setting up the Doomsday Network and improving the Doomsday Network before he got this job working with Nixon. Oliver North is the key person who helped with that change, getting it from just a nuclear disaster to, quote, a disaster. And that's how they got the FEMA into the idea of continuity of government. So in a Senate hearing, Oliver North raised this idea of the Doomsday Network. And Daniel Inouye, who was the senator from Hawaii, stood up and said, "You can't say that. You cannot put that on the record. Stop." So Oliver North was putting on the record this continuity of government planning. And it's absolutely this red zone when you get to these rules of secrecy. Now, interestingly enough, for people who are paying close attention, Daniel Inouye is one of the 3 senators who set up this phony AA tip program that Elizondo, the CIA master, comes out of, whose boss was John Brennan. Who were the 3 people? Daniel Inouye and Harry Reid, and then the other senator, his plane crashed, of course, and he was the senator from Alaska. So we have those 3 people who green-lighted the funding for AATIP, by the way, which is a program that doesn't exist. And they came forward, and that's how the story came out with the New York Times, about $22 million for searching out UFOs and the poor disgruntled Luis Elizondo coming forward. Poor disgruntled covert co-intelligence, COINTEL Elizondo, who was John Brennan's errand boy. Okay. So we're getting a picture now. Things are starting to formulate for us because we're seeing that, in a way, blocking North from talking about the Doomsday Network. When's the next time the Doomsday Network comes up? It comes up in the 9/11 Commission because Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld decide that they're going to use it during 9/11. They're actually going to put the COG plans into action. And they do. Actually, they go to a bunker and they are basically become this underground government. Now, it's quite fascinating because a number of things happened on 9/11. Like we're still now under the emergency rules of 9/11, and those emergency rules essentially suspend the Constitution. So we have to see that these things have real-world ramifications. But this idea of continuity of government, now that we understand some of the players, we understand some of the facts of it, whenever continuity of government gets run through a congressional type thing, like a hearing about money or whatever it is, it all falls into the classified world of the black budget. Because what's happening there is people are saying, you can't put on that on the record because it's all about us defending ourselves in the event of a worldwide emergency and creating a secondary government. No one can know what we're up to. So they can do anything in that environment. And the idea of creating large-scale nuclear bunkers across the country is what they did in the 50s. But after the nuclear threat with the Soviet Union was essentially gone, what happened to all that underground infrastructure? That's where we can get things like the secret Space Force idea in our heads about where that infrastructure is and where it comes from. So if you're with me on that, continuity of government created gigantic underground infrastructure that was originally on the surface, nuclear bunkers, nuclear cities in case of a nuclear war. Once that threat passed, you have this incredible infrastructure you can use now underground that nobody can access because it's all under classified details. What do you do with that program? When you're ready, you take the idea of the secret Space Force and you transform continuity of government into space. You have the same rules. Nobody can doubt your expenditures. You can draw from the black budget. They can't report on it. And if somebody says something in a Senate hearing committee, somebody like a Senate hearing committee leader, like Daniel Inouye, for example, will shut you down. So that gets us there. How are we doing, Olivia?
We are doing great.
Questions?
Well, I'll ask you one right now. Reason 8432 is asking, Committee of 300, is it involved in COG?
Well, it depends because there's a few different references. So what's the next one?
Okay. Well, there's some questions about Trump's guard that died of a stroke, and they think he was hit by an EMF.
Did you hear about that?
This is all news to me.
Actually, it's quite interesting when you get into it. Well, it was in Scotland, and it's one of those really unfortunate things, I have to say. I think he was relatively young. So when we look at it, we have to take a situation like that at its face value. Interestingly enough, Alexandra Bruce ran something in ForbiddenKnowledgeTV.net. And I'll find this here. She said that the president's taster, that's the title that she gave him. And she explored this idea. So I would recommend that video, actually. And ask me one more while I switch out.
Okay. Okay. How about a fun one? So Liberty Thunder is asking, is there any connection with Harvey, the Invisible Rabbit movie? which we love. It's one of our favorites.
My God,
that's my top
that
20 for sure.
Is a fantastic,
Hobby.
fantastic. I think any of the imagery from Alice in Wonderland and that style of imagery is telling. And the idea of this puka who can pop in and out of reality. When we get around the X, we know that we're playing with something quite fascinating. But let's jump from the X and COG, now that we've seen that COG can get moved into space and become a space force that's unaccountable. And that when Trump calls for a space force, it's quite unusual, actually. Let's look at the headline. Trump's space force will guard the U.S. from above, NASA chief says. That's really quite interesting. The interesting thing about that is, guard us from who? I mean, we already own the satellite lanes, so something coming in, inbound. Let's take just a quick look at quite an interesting oddity, which is this gentleman, Yuri Andropov. Yuri Andropov was the Secretary General for the Soviet Union before Gorbachev, and he was quite an interesting character. He was also a KGB chief, like Putin, and knew a heck of a lot, and he was only in there for 1 year before he died, interestingly enough. One of the things he implemented when he got in was a massive, massive program of UFO recon. And let's read this story now straight from The Guardian. KGB chief ordered 4 million soldiers to keep watching the skies for UFOs. Yuri Andropov, the former Soviet leader and longtime head of the KGB, had an acute personal interest in UFOs and ordered a 13-year program that required every soldier in the military to monitor sightings over Russian territory, according to new records. So they ran across these records. We find out about Andropov. And Andropov, being the Soviet counterpart to Reagan in 1983, before Gorbachev, he's looking hardcore at this UFO issue. And he's seeing the same things that Reagan is being fed before Reagan announces, hey, we need to do Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative. So what happens is there was speculation in the Soviet Union about a large unidentified object in the skies over Petrosnovik on September 20th, 1977. And so this biographer, Sinitsyn, now 70, said that one of his responsibilities was to monitor the foreign press, and he brought Andropov a magazine piece about UFOs. I dictated a summary of the piece to my secretary and was sure to express some doubts. But before I could see, before I would be worried he was concerned about my mental health, I dared to hand the summary to him. Sinitsyn was shocked by the KGB chief's reaction. Andropov handed him the text of an official report he had ordered from the Counter-Espionage Directorate. It described a UFO appearance in Astrakhan that an officer had seen while fishing. Andropov's personal interest in 1978, two committees were established to investigate UFOs, one military, one civilian. Andropov ordered 4 million Soviet soldiers to file detailed reports of incidents. They said the program led to hundreds of thousands of sightings being recorded in 13 years before it was abandoned with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1990. This is so crucial because when Reagan will, kind of confront Gorbachev and say, will you help us in the event of a war with these guys? Now we understand with Andropov setting up Gorbachev with 13 years of UFO monitoring, well, that's pretty helpful. It gives him a pretty good idea. Okay. There's two things, and I know we have to bust a move because we have to get into questions shortly. But let's do this. There's three planes that are very important to address in rapid succession. The Aurora, the Black Star, all of these are all X-planes, and the Valkyrie. Now, Valkyrie is what the Aurora plan X technology became. That is still a highly secret program, and I'm going to get you more details on it, and we're going to get into the whole naming system around Valkyrie. Black Star I found particularly interesting for a couple of reasons. Experimental orbital vehicle. The Black Star system is a rocket-powered space plane that is the heir to the X-20 dinosaur project. The Black Star is where the X-20 technology went. And that's kind of a crucial piece. I'm going to go deeper into the Black Star in the next episode, but I wanted to create that link here in your minds to X-20 dinosaur, which showed up again in Guy Bannister's information, and which again was responsible for the Blue Gemini tussle with the Kennedy administration. With X-20, this very important black project is where we get some of this incredible technology that's moving into the invisible plane realm. So keep in mind Black Star for next time. Aurora, of course, was the name of the incredible high-performance plane that came directly out of the Dornberger work. Once it was revealed, they did everything in their power to say, oh, it was a hoax, and you got the wrong idea or whatever. And Aurora literally got left in some documents, and that's how we found out about it. What happened was, after they kind of, with people like Ben Rich over at Skunk Works, cooling things out, and remember, he's famous for saying, we finally developed the technology to send ET back home. So what wound up happening, this is quite fascinating, with Aurora, is all of these rumors came out that that secret program was now called Valkyrie. Now, this is quite interesting, and you're not going to really find that in too many places. But I will tell you that the Valkyrie reference is exactly what happened with the Aurora. According to the trail that I'm following, that's where it went. Now, there's a lot to be said about an older program called Valkyrie, which was a program that was developed in 1958. And it was the most advanced plane that we had at the time. But this Valkyrie Echo here coming up again and becoming the new Aurora project, which is still highly secret. And we can see things like the X-37B, but the Valkyrie is completely secret. Let's take a quick look at where this comes from. So the Valkyrie are quite fascinating. This is Norse mythology, and it brings us into a different state of mind when we engage with it. But again, it was held over, and it was kept by early mystery school traditions. Here's some early depictions of it. These are Norse riders in the sky. They also appear to have a human/spiritual mythological dimension. They are certainly larger than life. And they are female. They are female warriors, and the name itself literally means to choose. And so it is, the idea is that they're able to choose who will live and who will die in a battle. And once someone is slain in a battle, where they will go. And the idea is that these Valkyrie will take the valiant soldier with his good karma to Valhalla, where he will have an influence on his ancestors for many years to come. And they kind of control and reward the virtue in this realm. And very often they're portrayed as muscular or shield-wielding women. So there's an Amazonian aspect. And when we were touching briefly on the Wonder Woman stuff earlier, you know, it's strange because so much of the imagery that comes into things when we try to do entertainment, comic books and stuff, there's that little portion there in the subconscious which activates the whole mythological field, and we see it in the Valkyrie. But here's a really key question. The Valkyrie have this psychospiritual aspect to them, completely supernatural. And they have the ability, they have the power over life and death, and they have the ability afterwards in the sphere of the afterlife to determine the conditions of the warriors that they select. Why are you going to choose Valkyrie if you are moving the X technology? And if you're moving the highest point of the X technology that is still secret, that is Aurora, when it converts into Valkyrie? Why are they going to be using that name? Why was there an earlier program called Valkyrie that disappeared after 6 years because of some collision? Something quite unusual about the ride of the Valkyries and how that makes an impression on the battle that we're having now with these invisible planes, with the advanced technology, with the apotheum effect, and with the secrets that are held in the UFO file. That bleeds over directly into our political process in the deep state through the media demanding that Trump be thrown out, not because he met with Putin specifically, but because of the idea that he may be working with Putin on this idea of a space force that is not just dominated by the deep state. This whole idea that Trump wants to move and develop his force and his place in this whole thing. What they were going to do, the deep state was going to roll out this anemically strange, bizarre John Podesta version of TTSA, who we know Tom DeLonge was working with all along. That was the Clinton initiative. That was their end of things. They're moving the UFO file out that way. So we have this kind of now freak morph thing because she didn't get in and the program's still rolling out like they can roll it out, and they use the assets in the New York Times and all the rest of it. Trump is over here first trying to make the Space Corps, which, by the way, Congress defeated him on. Nobody seemed to take any mention of the fact that he already announced the Space Corps. And this is a good point. Trump announces the Space Force. The president can't announce a Space Force. It has to go through Congress. He can announce a program and then say, let's get together and vote on it. He cannot create another version of the armed forces without Congress approving it. Just like Homeland Security, you still had to get the Congress on board. So I can't just say, I want a Space Force, that's my executive order. It's absurd. So what was he trying to do? And he never really explained why we should have it. The only explanation is what the NASA chief said, which is it'll protect us from enemies from above. So we have a really big puzzle. And in the very heart of these geopolitical mystery school aspects is the X Steganography. Now, even the fact that steganography was mentioned in the report that Rachel Maddow did on MSNBC is staggering. You know, that was when Olivia and I were laughing at it because, you know, I figured since 1600, I was practically the only person who probably mentioned steganography. But we're seeing this bleed over, and we're seeing the fever pitch, and the fever pitch that they got going when Trump shook hands, like Khrushchev met, like Reagan met with Gorbachev. When they meet without anyone but interpreters, when there's no staff, they can discuss the UFO file. The Space Force aspects come into play. The upshot of all of it, from my point of view, and I will continue to prove this point in time, that the invisible technology becomes the key factor inside the UFO file and the reality distortion field we've talked about, apotheum, and how it relates to the mystery schools. This is a truly hot button issue. And we need to get our minds wrapped around the idea of President Trump blurting out the invisible plane idea and the secret Space Force. The Space Force that he's alluding to, based on all this research, the continuity of government on information, keeping it secret, that Space Force already exists. So what Trump is essentially saying is, take the deep state black budget version of the space program and put it on budget, and let's profit from it and let me take credit for it. And I think the big disappointment for the deep state is he's trying to take that out of their grasp, one, and two, he's planning on partnering with other countries to do it. he's not doing the unipolar thing. So a very incredibly dangerous situation that we're discussing. And the only way I think we get a handle on it is following the X technology from programs like Aurora and Valkyrie, and to try to interpret here with our own kind of group intelligence why they're using terms like Valkyrie when they get to the most secret technology related to aviation and spaceflight. Why the Valkyrie? And with that, I will turn it over to Miss Olivia.
Okay, all right. So the first question, which we've heard before from John McKeever, is, DJ, don't you believe a Space Force already exists?
I have said it, yes.
Yes. So no more detail on that one?
Move to the next one.
Okay. Tamarishka Avi Edwards, is TTSA just a way of advertising the Space Force?
Well, before I get into that, please hold it because I forgot to show this. This is very interesting. That F-35 has its own patch, of course. One thing I found quite fascinating about it, if you look here, it picks up directly the background of the patch, and it shows this filled in. But it basically shows invisibility in the patch. Olivia, I want you to take a look at this. Isn't that interesting? Because you're the artist.
Where is the, oh, I see.
It's okay, directly there, right? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it's sort of half and half.
Unbelievable.
Cool.
This tells me that right in the patch, they're showing the invisibility. Not on the whole thing, but they're showing aspects of it with invisible parts. The other thing I wanted to show on this before we move, it's just a little note about the X-37B, and this comes from space.com. It's Mike Wall's article. Although the Air Force has disclosed some of the payloads that have flown to orbit on the X-37B, which again comes from the X-35, most of the space plane's onboard gear is classified, as are the details of its orbital activities. This secrecy has led to some speculation that the vehicle is some sort of space weapon, perhaps one designed to take out or capture satellites. Well, that sounds like a dangerous job. However, the Air Force has always denied this notion, insisting that the X-37B is just testing our technology for a future spacecraft. Oh, gee, we're just out there, you know, testing stuff out. Don't give us a hard time. It's only designed to carry various experiments up to space and back. What's the problem? Why are you giving us a hard time? Some of these technologies being tested may be sensors and other equipment for future spy satellites, outside experts have said. I think when they're on the track of looking at this and saying it's weapon-oriented, that's a bullseye. And remember, we have a space treaty from 1968 signed onto by all the major countries saying you cannot deploy weapons in space. So that would be a violation across the board if we just showed up out of the blue with the X-37B and it had the ability to be a space weapon. Remember, in Guy Bannister's notes, I'm going to go back to it again, it called the X-20 Dinosaur a space warcraft. That makes more sense to me than them just, for the hell of it, putting stuff up there. Remember that Reagan was scared by whatever they showed him, and he approached Gorbachev and said, will you help us if we go to war with this stuff that we're seeing, this off-world civilization? Okay. I forgot to show this. X-35B hat trick is an actual model that Lockheed sells. That's how popular this thing is internally. And we know that this hat trick thing relates directly to invisibility. This is what we've discovered. Now, here's a question I have for you, audience. In the X-35, in the hat trick logo, it shows the 3 cards, and it uses the cards. Olivia, tell us what the cards are that it uses.
Let's see. It's a heart. They're all aces. There's an ace of hearts,
ace of hearts,
a diamond, and a club, right?
A club. What is it that they left out?
Spade.
A spade. Why did they leave the spade out? That's your question. And the answer is actually going to help a lot to unravel this puzzle. I have some ideas, but I'd like to hear what you think. So send them to me at info@darkjournalist.com. Put them right here. But that's something I think that maybe we can puzzle out together, as it were. You're watching darkjournalist.com. Please remember to sign up for a free newsletter at the website, and that'll keep us in touch back and forth. It's kind of an important pipeline for us because we never know if the social media is going to just go away someday. And with some of the signs that we're seeing, it very well could. Also, you can support the show. Become a member, actually, at the site. We've made it very inexpensive, run discounts for it, so that it's an inexpensive subscription where you can get extra information. You're going to want to be a member because of the things that we're launching here in the summer and fall. And that's a deeper level of support. My thing is, and this is just a way that I do things, which is I try to get behind the things that are making the real differences for me. And that's something that Olivia and I take a deep look at in the things that we support. But certainly getting behind this show, you're getting behind the research that we're doing and helping us to do it. I think that's a really crucial aspect. So we really appreciate it. And I know there was someone that Olivia wanted to shout out to for helping us out. And his name was David. And basically that kind of support is definitely noteworthy, and we really appreciate it. And anytime that somebody goes to bat to get behind this show, trust me, with the amount of research and effort, we are making a difference, because what's happening is we are developing a whole different system for understanding these the kind of the times that we're in and how they link back to these deeper periods with the mystery schools and with the high technology. So we really appreciate it from my side, and certainly Olivia. It's one of the best things to do, basically, is to sign up for the show, show us that kind of support. And it's a very inexpensive subscription. I think it comes down to about $4 a month. And so that's the kind of thing that probably, you work it into your schedule and it makes a difference on the other side. And I always get behind those great sites that are in the alternative media, and we have many of those people come on the show also because we support the work that they do. And, there's great work out here now, and I want to say this, it just wasn't available, say 5 years ago, 6 years ago, not in the form that it is now. This is quite a period of time. And I've pointed this out before, that the mystery schools made a prediction on anthroposophy, and most spectacular prediction in 2016, that within 100 to 120 years, there was going to be this window that would open in case those mystery schools, like theosophy, like anthroposophy, failed. That opportunity was going to come up again for that deeper knowledge to seep in to the culture through groups who were studying this. And it seems to me that period, 2016 to 2036, that he references, that reference comes up over and over again in that work. And we're in that bullseye. So this is the period of time. And let's get behind the things that are really giving us that kind of information that can really change things and really make an impact. Okay. Well,
I just wanted to say we have a few responses on that Ace of Spades already.
Oh, wow.
So David Tormina says it's the wild card. And Kaelhar says traditionally the Ace of Spades is the death card.
True.
And Peter Rabbit says the spade is always up the sleeve.
Oh, that's true. The wild card I've always thought of as the Joker. Am I mistaken? David Tormina? One of the things I would say about the spade that does interest me is that I had expected when I saw it that they would leave the club out, because if they were trying to describe the hat trick and they needed to use the 3 and they wanted to show 3 aces, it seemed to me the club was the least symbolic. So when they left the other out, it became to me like, I've always thought of the Ace of Spades as really kind of the dominant ace of the entire batch. So that struck me as quite odd. And I couldn't help but think, and I know that there's a lot of different episodes that I'm bringing together here, but in the Alice in Wonderland episode, we studied something called the three hairs. And it is a very unusual phenomena. It goes all the way back to China and Iran, and they have early, like 2000 BC references to it. And there's a very unusual poem about turn and turn again that's related to it. No one seems to know what it means, and the explanations offered for it are really don't cut it. And I know a lot of good people are researching it now, but the important thing is those three aces and those three rabbits, there is that law of three thing that shows up in different types of traditions, like the Gurdjieff work, for example. Are we looking at something like that when we're talking about that? The other thing I want to point out in relation to the X35 is, quite unusually, they show in that patch, let's see if I have it, in the patch itself, they show the name hat trick in quotes. Now, how does that make you feel? What do you think of that, Olivia?
I'm sorry, I'm still reading. I'm reading. They're coming in with tons of insights about this card, so I'm dying to share some of them.
Okay, wait, let's show it then. I just want to point that out. This is what grabs me about it, that the hat trick is in quotes. Why is it in quotes? Mm-hmm. It's not a hat trick. It's the idea of a hat trick. Very unusual, quite unusual. And the order is hearts, clubs, diamonds. Also, I think kind of interesting. When we get around this X35, I don't mind going the deeper level and reading deeper levels of meaning into it, because you're dealing with the X technology directly. And it seems like anything around this, when you get this deep into their program, anything that they're putting out here is certainly significant. So I think we're discovering something there. Okay.
Okay.
Go for it.
I'll just give you a few. So James Clement says it means they have the Ace of Spades X technology as a last resort weapon. Ice Angel, if I can find what she said, it's a card of transformation, meaning or symbolizing the invisibility. And there was another great one. So the spades represent the sword.
Yes.
Christine Taggart, in the tarot, the Ace of Spades, aka Swords, cuts the line between illusion and reality.
Oh, interesting.
Isn't that great?
Well, it is quite fascinating. You know, when we look at the symbology that might be implied with the hat trick idea, we know that the 7 X's are embedded when they show it. So they've got 7 embedded X's, and then they have this very unusual hat trick, which I believe refers to invisibility. Leaving out the Ace of Spades does, it does seem to me it opens up some possibilities for us to really understand what they're doing. So let's roll that one around. Let's keep it going, because I think that there's an answer in there that will help us. And it'll become kind of part of the foundation of the show. What else have you got?
Okay, well, you didn't actually address the TTSA question.
What was it? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Now I've deleted it.
Oh, I think it was, are they advertising the Space Force? Mm-hmm. TTSA is a low-level CIA operation. And I call it low-level because it seems to me that they are spastic. That is, they roll out big things and say, big things are coming, and they utilize people in the UFO world who would have a good amount of respect, like George Knapp, who I've had great respect for. And, I've spoken to him before, and he's the person who brought Bob Lazar forward, help us to understand Area 51 and all the rest of it. But there is something that happens, I think, when you do this work, which is, it's possible that the subject itself becomes so exhausting that when people come forward and say, well, yes, I'm counterintelligence, but hey, I can help you with the UFO thing, it seems attractive. And if they let you into their conversations to be a fly on the wall and, hey, military intelligence will share this crumb with you, we're in that's not a good position to get good journalistic information from. So I was quite unhappy when George Knapp was speaking on Coast to Coast with Elizondo, and he referred to Elizondo's critics as a bunch of cranks. Well, Elizondo's boss is John Brennan, the drone king, in the Obama administration. Photos have surfaced, and I almost printed it out for tonight, of Elizondo running a shipping company in 2010 when he was supposed to be running AATIP. I don't know how that works. The shipping company was in Georgia or something. So there's just a lot of things that don't add up. Richard Dolan himself said that, what was the name of this program? Because it wasn't AATIP. Now we know that it wasn't called AATIP. And now we know that Harry Reid was involved. And I've already went through Daniel Inouye here. So there's a lot of questions. Look, we're not going to get the truth about the UFO file from a CIA counterintelligence agent. Counterintelligence agent means I make up a lie so that no one knows what I'm actually talking about. So, translation, I'm good at lying. So, Elizondo's job title is a good liar. And you need those in a spy organization, but that's not how you get transparency in the UFO field relating to the UFO file, which is already, it's quite a confused issue as it is. So, yeah, it is a good question, and they are all about marketing and advertising. But frankly, I think that a lot of the rollout around TTSA was botched, and that there's retreat involved in that whole process because, real journalists who deal with the UFO file would never put up with the kind of claptrap that they're running around with videos from a decade ago saying that, hey, check it out, it's new. So, yeah, that's my feeling on it. Okay, what else you got?
Okay, so Airwave 2K2 says, DJ, they use Valkyrie because it's reminiscent of the Nazi scientists, think Wagner and the Ride of the Valkyrie,
Yes.
And Hitler's admiration for his music. What do you think of that?
Wow, well, that's an excellent point. I do feel instantly when I got to Valkyrie, I felt like this was a Dornberger tie-over because the first choice of Valkyrie in the Dornberger X-Plane series was in 1958. And like I said, they discontinued that model. It went into a black project. But the very height of the program is Aurora, and Aurora converting into, on the secrecy side, Aurora converting into Valkyrie, I think, does tell us that it's the legacy of Dornberger, who was the Nazi rocket leader. We have to remember Dornberger was wanted by the Nuremberg trials to be executed. He was due to be executed. We grabbed him kind of the last minute. And even then, we didn't think we could reform him because he was such a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi. And a very unusual figure. By the way, visited the Nixon White House several times, and I got the records of him showing up for these dinners in the Nixon White House. So deep player. Wow. But great question. Okay, what do you got?
Okay, so Bill Ferry says, on a Russia Insight interview, Putin explained how U.S. presidents don't have control. Once elected, a man dressed in a black suit and tie visits the details control. Are we talking about Men in Black?
Wow. Well, Bill Ferry, as usual, always has good questions. The truth is, we don't know what takes place on that level. And even Putin is probably guessing because he has his own layers of secrecy there. But when he looks at the American system, I don't think he has any idea. But it is true that this secrecy level, I do feel when it involves the UFO file, is completely shoved aside. It is like, they don't want the presidents to know about this. And there are researchers out there who think, oh, the president's in charge of the cover-up. No way. The presidents have been kept out of the loop on the UFO file since Eisenhower, and they've gone through great pains to get back in the loop on that. And with Trump, I think he's hoping that by developing a military force and infrastructure for this secret space force to become the public space force, that he'll get a look at all the stuff that they've developed, and that this weird outside program that the Clintons were trying to do through Podesta and all that, through the TTSA, that program was their version. So Trump on the outside, Space Force, Clinton and that group, Podesta group, on the outside with TTSA, both aiming at this other stuff, which apparently resides somewhere between, military contractors, aerospace companies, What was it that Jim Garrison said? And why are his files held back when they let out these nationally historic files from the JFK assassination? His conclusion was that it was not, the assassination was not as he originally thought it was through just the Texas oil men, but that it was actually the payment for the assassination came out of the aerospace wing of the military-industrial complex. And he referred to Boeing, General Dynamics, and Lockheed. So that was his, that's the thing where he ran into. This seems to be really, when we're getting really close up to it, the hardcore base of the whole thing is somehow in the aerospace companies. Okay.
Okay, Barbara Joyce asks, one good symbol is worth a trillion words. DJ, do you think that the authentic crop circles are a language of symbols beyond words?
Well, thank you for saying authentic crop circles, because crop circles, as soon as they started to appear, got completely into this whole other realm. And they instantly fell into the disinformation pit, which is unfortunate because I've always believed that the early versions of the crop circles were absolutely true, and I think that they are a genuine phenomena. Now, there are researchers like Joseph Farrell who said that they are some kind of grimoire. They are a design that's being developed by microwaves, by these groups trying things with symbols. And I think that they certainly have the ability to do that. We've seen where some people have photographed what appear to be these lights making crop circles. However, even with all that in mind, and with the fakes in mind and all the rest of it, there are crop circles and there are occurrences, if you go deep into the literature on it, that can't be explained, and there's no way, there's no sign of human activity. And so therefore, my conclusion on it is that there's a genuine phenomena there, and there's a big wave of disinformation around it.
So are crop circles X technology?
Well, they could be an aspect, an outgrowth of someone using X technology. It's a good point. Absolutely. It's a very advanced group that's making the genuine crop circles.
Could the X not be secret, but not known yet?
The X Steganography is certainly known by mystery school initiates and by certain types of elite groups in intel circles. There's no question that they know it. They use it to hide something. This is what we have to go back to. When we're talking about the X is like a key. It's like looking through a keyhole. It represents something. So we have to see through the X to see what it is they're protecting on the other side of it. What it appears to me, from all my research that I've done around it, including taking in some of the best researchers and their views on secrecy in general, and looking at the deep history of the mystery schools and what they were trying to give us through groups like anthroposophy and theosophy, and people like C.G. Harrison with his book, The Transcendental Universe. When I look at that, what I see is that they, and Annie Besant, I should say, in relation to John Keely's technology. And, anyone who watches the show knows that Keely's technology, which was incredibly advanced in the late 1890s and supposedly had planes that could fly at 500 miles an hour back then, that technology went to theosophy because when he died, the people who were associated around him were afraid that these corporate raiders, they were already trying to say that technology was fake and all the rest of it, but that they were going to scoop it up. And it was shipped off to London and ended up with Annie Besant. And, that sign of Keely's funeral saying, "We don't know," the inventor has left a description of his secret. One of the things that Blavatsky does in The Secret Doctrine, which is really the hardcore word for the mystery schools that's out in public, is she says, well, Keely's technology, the mystery schools would never let it out because the temptation by these larger groups to use it to basically harvest the rest of the world would be too great, and the aggressive, might makes right would take over. So there's a weird balance that goes on here with the X technology where, yes, it's suppressed by these kind of corporate raiders and intel groups who thrive on secrecy and want this great kind of control of humanity. But the mystery schools also don't want higher information and higher technology to fall into those hands. So it's a very fascinating dance that goes on when we really get into this. And we have to keep, if we want to solve it, we have to keep the mystery school aspect in mind, in my opinion. The thing that I've come up with about it all is that inside the UFO file, inside Keely's information, inside the Tesla work, is something that relates to this effect that's a reality distortion field. If it's apotheum that they're hiding, then it's because they're continuing to work on it until they master it. And once they've mastered it, they can have that reality distortion field. So that gets very heavy. It's like a cosmological discussion at that point. It becomes an esoteric, ethereal conversation at that point. On one hand, we're talking here about planes and technology that's being hidden. Well, it seems to me we can look at it from two levels. And when one moves, the other moves with it. So at this level, if we're comfortable just looking on the technology side, we can relate the X technology. We can hunt down the X Steganography that's been hidden through the UFO file, through these different government agencies, through these space agencies and developmental experimental projects. That's one whole clean way to look at it. But then the other deeper implication is that since the mystery schools have been involved, and the mystery schools deal with things like higher initiates and higher beings and a whole spiritual reality, then we can see that there's a counterpart to holding the secrecy and in the kind of general evolution of humanity. So the conversation around the X gets very, very deep, if that makes any sense.
Density McCartney is asking, why keep free energy chained?
Well, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, because you run on an oil paradigm, a fossil fuel paradigm, which is making a small group incredibly rich. And you've built an entire infrastructure on it that in 1903 and to 1906, people like Tesla were ready to completely blow away. We would have been way more advanced with his wireless energy. So it's a financial advantage, really. That's what it comes down to. The other thing is you may not want to open up other technologies while you're working on them and becoming the master of them yourself. One of the things that's fascinating to me is that when we get into these areas of advanced technology or, the whole who controls the world thing, when I speak to people like Catherine Austin Fitts, she tells me we're talking about a very, very small group. When I talk to Professor Scott about the deep state, again, he suggests it's a small group. So we're really looking at a small group having an incredible impact over 7 billion people. Quite remarkable. And I want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. You're also going to find incredible videos and things there that are available for the public. But the newsletter is the way to keep up with what we're going to do. We have many things coming up. I have a 3-part interview series with Catherine Austin Fitts on the Space Force that is going to be released. I needed to do this episode first, but that's all coming out starting next week. So there's many things you're going to want, and some are going to be public and some will be for subscribers. And those subscribers who support us, we really appreciate that support. And it makes a big difference. And we're going to make it up to you by giving you some incredible things behind the scenes. So, but that newsletter really is the pipeline. So make sure you get there, sign up, and what's going to happen is you're going to get a confirmation email immediately. Look for that, because if you don't confirm, then it just hangs out there as you trying to sign up and you never confirmed. I might have to change the subject line of that confirmation email just to be like, it's really a dark journalist. But yes, we're doing a lot better with that system, I think, than the earlier system. So thank you, everyone, for your commentary on that. Okay, you're up.
JJK, have any of the Nikola Tesla papers ever been released or seen?
Well, we did an episode. It was the last episode. I would refer you to that one. which is Tesla, Trump, and the X technology, because we get deep into where Tesla's papers disappeared to, and there's no question that they were taken. So what they do have is they have in, in his native country, they have his essential records that they've let out. And there are things there. There's his biography and all the rest of it. But the stuff that he hid and the stuff that John Trump got a look at, that whole thing disappeared. And the story that it all got sent to his nephew, who was the Yugoslavian ambassador to the U.S., that ambassador came forward later and said, no, I never got it. So, that information went deep. But what's fascinating is it seems to me when we were tracking it last time that the military was looking for it on one hand. There's a record from 1958 that they wanted it, and they were going to the FBI. And it looks like the FBI was ping-ponging with who they said had it, who was the Office of Alien Property, and that doesn't make any sense. So somebody in between there has it. And those groups can work in the cracks between the CIA and the FBI. That's quite remarkable.
Californology was asking, was it the X Protect group that denied Wright Field the Tesla materials?
Yes, that's the group that's in the cracks. Mm-hmm. X Protect is very important to understand. It's a whole corridor of intel covert groups that work seemingly right in coordination with the intelligence agencies, but they work in the cracks somehow. So whatever is going on there, they're able to elude major agencies like the FBI. That's power, no question about it. One of the things that Professor Scott pointed out to me in relation to the deep state is that it's one thing to say that there are intelligence operatives involved in the deep state, of course, but it seemed to him that groups like Booz Allen Hamilton, who were contractors outside that would be brought in by these groups, form another element and another unpredictable, unaccountable group. It could very well be that somewhere in the contracting agencies resides the agents of X Protect. And if you look at some of the key cases, like Rendlesham Forest, it seems like X Protect shows up almost immediately, changing these people's lives, changing their stories, demanding they change their stories, discrediting them, whatever it happens to be. Quite remarkable when you think about it. X Protect is certainly a reality. Whenever you dig into it, just look at Morris Jessup. Donald Kehoe referred to them as the Silence Group. So that's a good place to start. That's in 1957. This conversation spans decades. And I think the reason they've gone round and round is because they've not connected. They didn't have the signifier. They didn't have the key, which is the X. But then they didn't have the connection between the mystery schools and the technology. That's a pretty big disconnect. You put those two together, and that's nuclear fusion. I mean, we really get somewhere different. I believe, based on this information, our plateau of knowledge is going to move from the level that we're on to somewhere totally different if we can figure out what the X Steganography is telling us in relation to the UFO file and the mystery school secret around the reality distortion effect that I call apotheum here. Those things, I think, have the ability to change our entire worldview, really.
Okay, Lewis Richardson, X.com was created by Elon Musk. Could that be something?
Well, there's no question. He's right in the heart. He's a commercial dangle. I mean, I don't say that to minimize him. I'm sure he has a lot of really good ideas. But he's a commercial dangle in this field, and they need someone to refer to. But the fact that he's closely chosen to identify himself with the X every step of the way, from that XCOM, SpaceX, and the X model of the Tesla cars and all the rest of it, he's right in the heart of the commercial version of what they would do with the X technology. Remember, aside from being an incredible, a real good secret has to be hidden in plain sight. That's steganography. Remember, cryptography was this thing that everyone knew was a puzzle and couldn't solve it. That's generally a good description of cryptography. That it's there and there's no way to read it. Or you spend all this time trying to solve the puzzle. But steganography, you never realize it's a puzzle in the first place. The steganography of the X is there hidden in plain sight. People who can see it, they observe it. So if you can speak the language of it, this is another thing that Gurdjieff said, which is, a lot of the native tribes contain books in their dances. And when they're doing certain dances, they're acting out scenarios that are chapters from different books. They've learned it. So you can read a great deal by watching the ritual. Well, it's quite fascinating because if you have the vocabulary of the dances, you can get the story. If you don't, it just looks like a good dance. And that's a good explanation of steganography. But I certainly think it makes a big difference. Okay.
Okay, Mr. Eggshin, who does the X Protect group answer to? And Reason 8432 is asking, is X Protect involved with the Clinton fixers?
Well, the Clinton thing and the Clinton death lists and all that relate to the political power situation, and we've seen that with the Bushes too. When somebody gets too close to their operations, they're discredited or they're, eliminated. Those are political operatives and political operations. The X Protect thing relates directly to holding the secret of the X technology, which is in the UFO file. So whatever that technology represents, whatever effect is created, it's like, it's like in the 40s, killing someone over the atomic bomb secrets or putting them in prison or in a nut house to suppress them if they're ready to let that secret out. Now, an interesting thing came up in relation to the Kennedy assassination. It's kind of a good answer to your question. And Joseph Farrell actually did a great blog on this. But there's been this story out for a while about a cryptographer who was stationed in Europe from America, and he caught up some chatter that President Kennedy was going to be assassinated on November 28th. And this story was always unusual. He sent word to the White House and Robert Kennedy, but he decided at a certain point it just wasn't going to get to them in time. So there was a major UN event going on, and he decides, hey, I'm going to show up and at this press conference and announce it. So he goes to do that, and the military grabs him and puts him in a nut house for 6 months. So this is an interesting story that's been out there for a while, but everyone always wondered, what's the upshot of it? And he heard this chatter about this assassination, but what was it? So as it turned out, on April 26th, when those Trump JFK release records came out, and they've been coming out in dribs and drabs, and they're still heavily censored. But nonetheless, some good information comes out. So there's another story about a military cryptographer, and this one was stationed in Oregon. And he tells essentially the same story, November 28th, and all the rest of it. And what happened to him? Well, he was put in a mental institution for a year after he came forward to his military superiors and said this is going to happen. So those reports are on the record now, and they corroborate each other. By the way, the chatter that he picked up related to CIA figures. So it's pretty compelling that that's out there and available. It's confirmation of the first story, and it also is confirmation of CIA planning against President Kennedy. What's that related to? Well, the information that we have is that Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file because he wanted to share it ultimately with the Russians and with the public eventually, because that's where he thought this whole thing was going, that kind of openness. Well, we can see that the ability of that kind of openness has shrunken down to the type of transparency that we have now, which is pretty much zilch. So when we get Trump and Putin up there, two of the most powerful nuclear nations on the planet, and they shake hands and they want to meet and talk and discuss things, not with the deep state listening in, the entire structure freaks out and says, you're a traitor and you're all these things. Well, no, you'd be a traitor if you weren't trying to reach out to other companies and work with them. So this stuff is all related directly to the political process that we're seeing unfold. And the Space Force is right in the center of it, along with President Trump.
Roha Khan, would the dark journalist be in favor, as I am, of shattering the clowns in action into a million pieces and scattering them to the wind, as Kennedy wished?
Yeah, you know, you gave me a perfect segue, which is, boy, I have two really good things here for everyone. But this is the person who set up the CIA, which is Harry Truman. This is from the Washington Post, okay? I'm going to cut to the chase. Basically, Harry Truman, who set up the CIA, said this a month to the day after the Kennedy assassination. I think it's become necessary to take another look at the purpose and operations of our Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. I'd like to submit here the original reason why I thought it necessary to organize this agency during my administration, what I expected it to do, and how it was to operate as an arm of the president. Boy, is it not an arm of the president nowadays. So he says, you know, the president's performance in office is as effective as the information he has, the information he gets. So he goes on, and I'm going to move down here as to what he says. This is the real key point. For some time, I've been disturbed by the way the CIA has been diverted from its original assignment. It's become an operational and at times a policy-making arm of the government. He's warning here about the covert government taking over the overt public government and instituting policies which have nothing to do and nobody's voted on them. So again, it's become an operational and at times policy-making arm of the government. This has led to trouble and may have compounded our difficulties in several explosive areas. He's saying they're getting us into trouble. They're going to get us into World War III. I never had any thoughts when I set up the CIA. This is President Harry Truman in 1963, a month after Kennedy got assassinated. I never had any thought that when I set up the CIA that it would be injected into peacetime cloak and dagger operations. He's saying it was never meant to do these covert operations in peacetime. Some of the complications and embarrassment I think we've experienced are in part attributable to the fact that this quiet intelligence arm of the president has been so removed from its intended role that it is being interpreted as a symbol of sinister and mysterious foreign intrigue and a subject for Cold War enemy propaganda. In other words, not only are they doing these covert things that are clearly illegal and unconstitutional, but they're making us look bad. Because now in the imaginations of these other countries, they're thinking, oh my God, this thing is running wild. With all the nonsense, okay, moving down. I well know the first temporary director of the CIA, Admiral Soares, and the later permanent directors of the CIA, Vandenberg and Allen Dulles. And I assume that with their patriotism and integrity, I assume this is true of all those who continue in charge. But there are now some searching questions that need to be answered. I therefore would like to see the CIA be restored to its original assignment as the intelligence arm of the president, and that whatever else it can properly perform in this special field, that its operational duties be terminated or properly used elsewhere. Operational duties be terminated. So he's saying reform it or abolish it. Clear. That's the position that I hold in relation to this material, which is the CIA, you know, was meant to serve a certain type of a purpose. These guys have their own Air Force now. I mean, they've become too powerful a wing, and now what they're trying to do is overthrow a duly elected president. Whether you like Trump or don't like Trump, we should never allow this extra constitutional agency to overthrow a duly elected president. Okay, so that's my answer on that one. And it's Harry Truman's answer. Okay, we'll take two more questions, and it's been fantastic. Everybody's asked such great questions tonight. And Olivia, you're really on a roll.
Okay. So. James Clements again. The CIA infiltrated all MSM after the assassination of JFK. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, well, they had been active overseas spreading misinformation about things. And what happened is they turned that process internally here. Now, back then you got, you know, kind of a scant, small, there were like 3 channels and 3 networks and all the rest of it. And but as time wore on into the 70s, there was much more openness that was happening, and there were more outlets of the media, and it was a much different situation. And that's where you got some real transparency. The CIA basically got busted during that period in the Church Committee hearings and all the rest of it. And according to Professor Scott's work, if you really look deeply into the American deep state, they went offshore, the CIA, during this period. That's the end of the Ford administration into the Carter administration. And Stansfield Turner was a real outsider, took over the CIA as a friend of Carter's, and he just had no idea what was going on. Interestingly enough, Richard Helms was the former CIA director. He became the ambassador to Iran. We know there was a huge blowout in Iran in '79. But what's interesting is the Safari Club was a group of intelligence heads of other countries, and they interacted with arms dealers. So again, you always have the CIA around this nexus of arms dealers, the drug trafficking, and these other heads of intelligence groups. But here, these people were former American intel people who didn't have an official position even. They were just hanging out waiting for the Carter administration to be over. And so they're referred to as the Safari Club in the work of Peter Dale Scott. And I think that's worth deeper investigation. Okay, and you can find that that's in the Doomsday Network interview I did with Professor Scott. All right.
Okay.
We'll take two more questions.
Well, Mythmaker says, do you remember the Northrop commercials a couple of years ago with invisible soldiers and aircraft carriers?
Oh, yeah. Good
right
point.
On mainstream TV.
True. No, the invisible thing, we've really tripped into it tonight. We're going to do more on this. Two aspects we've brought forward here tonight that are crucial. The invisible plane revelation that Trump made, that Lockheed Martin tried to walk back, and the invisible UFO history from 1943 on of these planes running into these things and getting demolished. And that even there's an element of an invisible UFO in the Tic Tac video that everyone talks about, that whole case. There's a large portion of the case that relates to this invisible UFO. So absolutely fascinating.
Science Churchill is asking, remote viewing of nanosatellites around Earth shooting down objects, X Protect related?
I think there are programs we have no idea. But I have reports here. I was going to read some tonight, but we got so deep into it. I will read more of what I got. But these reports were about shoot down orders between in the late 40s and the 50s, and some of those encounters and what took place and how the craft involved responded to us firing upon them. So I believe we got way more aggressive, especially in America, with the overflights of these unknown craft. And that I think that's what is responsible in part for the cut down in sightings that we've seen. I do feel that there's a lot that goes on in relation to, I think that we're still, our powers, apparently, UFOs show up very often around nuclear sites. We know this. I think they have a pretty good, they're always estimating what we're up to. We don't know which group that is that's doing it. But I do feel that, that encounter, which no one talks about, shows up in incidents like what you're talking about. So it is absolutely something that's just out of reach. There's no regular reporting that we have going on it, but I think it does happen.
Okay, I saved the best for last.
Here it comes.
James Clements again. David Wilcock is leaving Gaia due to what he called a Luciferian agenda in their Ancient Civilization series. What does Daniel think about this stunning revelation?
Well, look, here's the thing. A lot of the kind of entertainment circusy version of the secret space stuff I've gone into extensively last year, and I think we get a pretty good foundation of what I feel about those groups. And I feel that they're entertainment-driven, drama-driven, and financially motivated. I think that a lot of those groups dealing with the Gaia thing, it strikes me, I hear a little bit of marketeer versus marketeer now, or, I didn't get enough money for this or that. So that's the way I'm taking that. I don't take it very, very seriously. I've always felt that those people and their efforts would be better put towards fiction, really, and it would spare them the trouble of trying to plagiarize legitimate researchers like Joseph Farrell and Catherine Austin Fitts around the secret space program. But yeah, it is kind of interesting, isn't it, when that end of the spectrum kind of turns on each other. It creates a kind of an interesting atmosphere, doesn't it? My thing is, with the kind of work that we're doing, I really don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about them, but I do feel that there must be really, in the grand scheme of things, a separation of real research, around real topics, deep topics, and then the kind of entertainment Gaia-driven stuff. Now, what's interesting is when, Gaia has promoted things, sometimes it blows up in their face, right? Because the people that they're promoting, when they're saying, hey, go over the edge and make up any story you want with no evidence, at certain points, those people may actually turn back and bite the hand that doesn't feed them at a certain point. And that's the kind of battle I think you're seeing going on there. And my thing is, hey, look, we can do so many things. There's incredible work that's available in the alternative research community. Joseph Farrell's work, Catherine Austin Fitts. These are the people who are really bringing the work forward. Spending time in the X series, wow, we've got real information. And, that's the kind of material that I said hasn't been available before. This is a very unusual period. And before that, we have people like Theosophy and Anthroposophy, the Edgar Cayce work. It's life-changing, inspiring work. So that's the stuff really that's where I spend most of my time. But yeah, I'm as amused as anyone else and things like that.
Could I just take a couple more?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. So Bo Krills has been just trying to get me to
listen. I said question. You're the boss.
Okay. All right. Please ask Daniel.
You say jump, and I say how high. You know how this works.
Have you ever heard of the Navy's F-19? And if so, what do you know? Navy stealth, real or not?
Well, this is what we're getting at, isn't it? Because the invisibility thing, again, so many things that relate to all the way back to the Philadelphia experiment, that's Project Invisibility. So, of course, it's an incredible thing if you could become invisible on the battlefield and everywhere else. So when you assess these things, you get wild stories, sure. But nonetheless, there's enough fundamental, foundational information available in the record to lead you to conclude this. Now, we've shown the invisible UFO, the invisible plane information tonight. That's a really good jump-off point. The UFO file, having that aspect in it, that would explain a lot of the secrecy if invisibility is a major part of that apotheum effect. That if you could achieve invisibility and control it, it's an incredible advantage. Probably the type of advantage that would allow you to dominate the entire Earth and all the inhabitants on it. So yeah, in terms of do I believe that one particular story, I think invisibility, the way we brought it up tonight, is entirely, highly possible. Okay.
Okay. All right. Last question. Vancouver Joe, DJ, very interesting. I'm convinced. Now, what would you have us do other than just keep listening?
What would I have you do? Well, I really, honestly, my feeling is the more information we get, the more our awareness rises, and all kinds of things happen when your awareness rises in any environment. I do feel that there's hypnosis. You know, I think back to Rudolf Steiner's quote about the mass media then, 1919, which he called black magic. But the media has so much control, and, you know, you have normal people, you know, who seem on the surface to be highly intelligent, who will come up to me and say, oh, Trump is, you know, Putin's puppet. And, you know, he's a paid off puppet and he's a traitor to the country, you know, and it's all because they've been watching some Rachel Maddow report, and Rachel Maddow is on MSNBC, and General Electric controls MSNBC, and they stand to make great profits from a war. So, you know, you see how this process works, and you see that the mind control aspect works on even what would be considered 21st century chic, intelligent people. So, I suppose in the grand scheme of things that we need to raise our awareness. And part of that is by tuning into abilities that we didn't know we had. And I think that is the legacy of the mystery schools. And I think that it'll help us sort out our geopolitical process and the political leadership questions better through having that kind of transparency and insight. So there's tremendous possibilities in the work that we're doing here in the X series. So that's the track. We're on it for a reason. Okay, Olivia, amazing. Gee, you did an incredible job as usual. And next week, we will see everyone listen up. Friday, the 27th, and Saturday, the 28th. Two-part, the 20th episode of the X series. We're going to go deep into the mystery school aspects with the Gurdjieff Ouspensky work, and we're going to go deep into breakthrough energy with the president of New Energy Movement, and that is Susan Manowich. And we are also going to reveal our ex-witness who she was going to join us tonight, and we did a preliminary showing with her, but her audio had a lot of issues. So what we did is we figured out a way around the audio, but it's going to take a couple of days for her to install it. So she is going to be here with us, and she is an ex-witness who's going to go on the record. We have all that for you next week, and plus subscribers will also get the Catherine Austin Fitts Space Force parts. And so we have so many things coming up over the next couple of weeks. It's going to be incredible. Please go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the free newsletter. That keeps us in touch no matter what. Support the show, get behind it, and sign up for a subscription. And we will see you next week. And it's great to see so many people out there. I always have to shout out a few at the end. And Najat is out there. It's great to see you. And boy, oh, it's flying. It is flying fast now. I'm going to leave you all with a fascinating image that I like to show from time to time. And this is Annie Besant and Henry Alcott, who Alcott was the founder of Theosophy, and Besant took it to new heights. And that is an X ritual that they are performing for their awareness. And really, it is quite fascinating, the impact that their knowledge of the X and the things that they carried over with them. I always like to remind people that when we're talking about these issues, they go back hundreds of years, and we're getting hundreds of years and, you know, people's minds and insights over the whole course of time. I will leave you with this shot, which was the first American in space. Hold on just a second. I have too many here. Shaking hands with President Kennedy. When President Kennedy was spinning the Space Force and shaping it the way he thought it was going to go, but things sure did change. But there was that moment. Never let it be forgot that once there was a Camelot. And we will see you next week.
2 shows. Get ready.
It's gonna be some heavy lifting. In that case, what's for dinner?
Tequila, of course.
Tequila.
Tequila and pizza.
Tequila and pizza. That's Friday
Extra
night.
olives.
What kind of olives, though?
Kalamata.
Hey, listen, I'm there. I'm there with bells on. We will see you next week, and thank you so much. I see we have Peter Rabbit, a cult fan, is out there. Daniel Natal, all great. Indiana Jones. And I think I saw Rika out there.
Rika is back.
Unbelievable. It's great to have you back. Fubar Fighter and David Turner.
I have to say, Fubar Fighter wanted me to ask you
Science Churchill is out there.
About Dolan and Lavenda. Do you want to just pop in with one little comment on that?
Occult Priestess.
I guess
Elena Starta. Excellent. I know you've been a supportive member for a long time. It's great to see you out there. So Rich Dolan and Peter Lavenda?
Lavenda was on Defending TTSA, I guess, on Dolan's show. Did you want to?
I think that's from a while ago, but I did. Yeah, I heard that. look, you know, a guy like Peter Levenda knows a lot, and there's a lot of writers that these people can recruit under what seem like normal circumstances. My advice to them at this point, now that they've had this relationship with these people, is maybe it's not so hot to be seen with, you know, the Podestas and the CIA. I mean, how about go back to your own central track where people like your own work? And, you know, I think that's a better way to go. So, you know, but I can't, I wouldn't have anything bad to say about Levenda's work. Certainly not. I would pick better people to do it for, you know, and I think it's tough as a writer. It's not, the opportunities aren't always easy. Okay. Does that answer your question?
This comments says, is he going to show the devil pic? Obsessed with the Ahriman photo. Do you have a picture of that you can show right now?
Oh, well, I would never show Ahriman out of context. Let me tell you, it's not something I enjoy looking at or showing to people. But there's lots of shows that we've done. Any of the shows on the 8th Sphere will have Ahriman there. He's in the thumbnail. But yeah, certainly, trust me, Ahriman is not going to be left out of the two-parter next week. He plays a starring role as usual. And okay, so I had it Never Let It Be Forgot Once There Was a Camelot. And we will see you next week. Olivia, fantastic, by the way. Great job. I really appreciate it. And everyone, it's Olivia. It's Olivia's night. And we will see you next week. And in the meantime, I'll be looking forward to everyone out there solving the question of why the hat trick does not have the Ace of Spades in it. That's quite a mystery to me. And I love the start that we got on that tonight. So let's go further even still. All right, we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
I think the steganography is going to your head. That's great. That's a great t-shirt too. Okay. And we'll see you later.